Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world brimming with challenges, struggles, and countless distractions. Whether we are wrestling with personal dilemmas, the weight of expectations, or the burdens of our own hearts, we are often overwhelmed by the magnitude of our problem. And yet, it is in such moments when we must ask ourselves, where does our focus lie? In the world today, it is tempting to devote ourselves entirely to our problems, to fixate on them. The human condition is such that when troubles arise, our minds are quick to dwell on them. But as the great C.S. Lewis once suggested, we must take a different approach, a more profound spiritual one. C.S. Lewis, in his distinctive style, would remind us that the battle we face is not just a material one. Our minds, hearts, and spirits are in constant turmoil because we often place our attention on the wrong thing. He would assert that the focus on our problems, however real and pressing, can lead to despair, confusion, and a sense of hopelessness. But to focus on God, to place our trust in His goodness and power, is to transform our very perspective on our challenges. Consider for a moment the words of Lewis in the Screwed Up Letters. He writes about the subtle ways in which the enemy, that is evil, seeks to divert our attention away from the divine. The most effective way to make a man miserable, he suggests, is to keep him constantly focused on himself. From when we allow our thoughts to spiral inward, preoccupied with our worries, we lose sight of God's greater plans for us. But why must we, as C.S. Lewis would counsel, fix our eyes on God instead of our problems? The answer lies in the understanding that our problems are temporary and finite, but God's love and power are eternal. Problems, as significant as they may feel, are but brief moments in the grand narrative of our lives. For if we only allow ourselves to be consumed by them, we risk missing out on the profound joy and peace that come from fixing our gaze upon the Creator of the universe. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, "The real problem is not that we are too weak to solve our problems, but that we forget that we are never alone in the struggle. Our struggles are not a solo endeavor. They are part of a divine tapestry that stretches far beyond our understanding, where God is ever present, working alongside us and granting us strength through His grace." Furthermore, when we focus on God, we begin to see our problems from a different vantage point. Instead of seeing them as insurmountable obstacles, we start to recognize them as opportunities for growth, for transformation, and for a reliance on Him. Our suffering in this light becomes redemptive. It is no longer a burden, but a means of drawing closer to the One who holds the answers to our deepest questions. One of the most profound teachings of C.S. Lewis lies in his assertion that the more we look to God, the more we are equipped to handle life's struggles. He writes, "Aim at heaven, and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth, and you will get neither." What Lewis implies is that when we direct our focus toward God, we not only receive spiritual fulfillment, but we also find the tools we need to navigate our earthly problems with resilience and peace. When we face difficulties in life, our natural instinct is often to focus intensely on the problem at hand. The weight of our struggles can consume us, and it's easy to become preoccupied with how we might overcome them. This focus can easily turn inward, causing us to dwell excessively on our own limitations, fears, and anxieties. Yet in moments like these, we are urged to shift our focus from ourselves to God, a perspective that transforms our approach to every challenge we face. C.S. Lewis, a master of exploring human nature and spiritual growth, frequently discussed the dangers of self-centeredness and the profound in turning our attention outward toward God. In his writing, particularly in the Screwtape Letters, Lewis illustrates how our enemy evil forces works to keep us obsessed with ourselves. The enemy does this by amplifying our fears, convincing us that our struggles are insurmountable, and that we are entirely alone in them. The more we focus on our own inadequacies, the more we spiral into self-pity and despair. This inward focus draws us further away from God, and instead of seeking divine strength, we rely on our own limited abilities. It's in these moments of self-absorption that we become most vulnerable to the lies of our adversary. However, when we choose to redirect our focus to God, a powerful transformation takes place. Instead of seeing ourselves as isolated in our struggles, we recognize that we are part of a larger story, one where God is both the creator and the sustainer. Shift from self to God is not simply a change of thought. It is a fundamental reordering of our priorities. It involves trusting that there is a divine purpose in everything we encounter, even when the road ahead seems unclear or difficult to navigate. Lewis touches on this idea in Mere Christianity, when he writes about the Christian journey as one that requires a continual reorientation of our hearts and minds toward God. For him, the goal is not to escape our challenges but to face them with a confidence that stems from knowing that we are not alone. This shift in focus brings with it a sense of freedom. When we focus on God, we are liberated from the crushing weight of our worry. Rather than being consumed by anxiety about how we'll solve a particular problem, or whether we'll be able to cope with future trials, we begin to trust that God is with us in the midst of it all. In moments of distress, it's natural to want control over our circumstances. We may believe that if we just focus enough on a solution, we can make it work. Yet, when we surrender our need for control and turn to God, we open ourselves to His wisdom, which is far greater than our own. We find peace in His sovereignty, knowing that even in the most chaotic situations, He is in control. Moreover, focusing on God helps us see our problems through a different lens. Instead of viewing them as obstacles that exist solely to hinder our progress, we begin to understand them as opportunities for growth and refinement. Lewis often wrote about how suffering, when viewed through the lens of faith, becomes a means of drawing closer to God. In his book, The Problem of Pain, he tackles the difficult subject of human suffering and argues that pain, while painful and hard to understand, can be a tool for spiritual development. It purifies our hearts, teaches us reliance on God, and sharpens our ability to empathize with others. When we focus on God, we gain the perspective that our suffering is not meaningless or random, but part of a divine process in which God is actively involved. When we encounter difficulties, our immediate reaction is often to view them through a limited and personal lens. We see them as obstacles that stand in our way, as challenges that we must conquer with our own strength. Our problems can easily become all-consuming, and we can find ourselves overwhelmed by their weight. However, one of the most profound truths we can discover in the midst of struggle is that God's power can completely transform our perspective on those very problems. Rather than being simply something to endure or overcome, our struggles can become opportunities for growth, learning, and a deeper connection to God when we allow His power to shape how we see them. C.S. Lewis, with his characteristic insight into the human condition, understood that the way we perceive our problems is often more important than the problems themselves. In his writing, Lewis frequently emphasized the need to align our hearts and minds with God's perspective. He understood that the human experience is full of suffering, confusion, and hardship, but he also believed that it is through our relationship with God that we can find the strength to face these trials. When we allow God to transform our perspective, we no longer see our difficulties as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger divine narrative in which God is working. One of the key ways that God's power transforms our perspective is by shifting our focus from our own limited abilities to His infinite strength. In our human frailty, it is easy to become consumed by the idea that we must handle everything on our own. The temptation is to look inward and search for the solutions within ourselves. We become trapped in the cycle of self-reliance, constantly attempting to solve our problems through our own wisdom and effort. This inward focus can often lead to frustration, fear, and a sense of helplessness, especially when our solutions don't work or when we are faced with situations that are simply beyond our control. However, when we shift our perspective to God, we are reminded that we are not alone in our struggles. God, in His infinite power, is always with us, offering His strength, wisdom, and guidance. In the Bible, we are reminded repeatedly of God's ability to handle the impossible. Whether it's the parting of the Red Sea or the feeding of the 5,000, God's power shows us that there are no limits to what He can accomplish. When we focus on God, we are reminded that our problems, however overwhelming they may seem, are not beyond His reach. He is able to intervene in ways we cannot imagine, and His ways are far greater than our own. In a world that often feels tumultuous and unpredictable, peace can seem like an elusive goal. We are bombarded by challenges, financial struggles, relationship issues, personal fears, and the weight of daily pressures that threaten to unravel our sense of stability. In such moments, the search for peace can lead us to seek temporary comforts or strategies that promise relief. Yet true and lasting peace comes not from avoiding or denying life's difficulties, but from focusing on God. When we center our attention on Him, rather than on the problems themselves, we find a peace that transcends circumstances and a resilience that allows us to endure trials with hope and confidence. C.S. Lewis, in his writings, consistently pointed to the importance of focusing on God in order to find peace and resilience. In his book, Mere Christianity, he speaks about how human beings are naturally restless until they align their hearts with God's will. This restless state is often magnified by our struggles. When our hearts are weighed down with worry, we can easily fall into despair or be overcome by the pressures of life. But when we focus on God, we are reminded of His sovereignty and the eternal hope He offers. This shift in focus brings peace, because we are no longer relying solely on ourselves or our limited understanding of the world. When we place our attention on God, we acknowledge that He is in control, even in the midst of chaos. The Bible repeatedly encourages believers to trust in God's plan, to lean not on their own understanding, but to acknowledge Him in all things. This act of trusting in God's providence brings an inner calm that is not dependent on external circumstances. God's peace is not a fleeting feeling based on good circumstances, but a deep and abiding assurance that, No matter what happens, we are safe in His care. Lewis in his own life experienced many personal hardships, yet he often spoke of the peace that comes from knowing that God's purposes are far beyond what we can comprehend. In the screwed up letters, he shows how the enemy evil seeks to steal our peace by getting us to focus on the fleeting, the temporary, the immediate. But true peace comes when we focus on the eternal and the unchanging nature of God. In addition to peace, focusing on God also builds resilience. Resilience is not simply the ability to bounce back from adversity, but the capacity to endure and grow stronger through life's trial. When we focus on God, we tap into a wellspring of strength that comes from His presence. The Apostle Paul, in the New Testament, speaks of finding strength through God when he is weak. He famously writes, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." 2 Corinthians 12:10. This paradoxical statement illustrates the deep truth that in our moments of weakness, God's strength is made perfect.